Dog saves a child trapped in a storm drain. What rescuers found left everyone speechless. Pablo? Sarah's voice cracked as she called out her son's name, her heart pounding louder than the storm around her. The rain came down in torrents, flooding the narrow streets of their small neighborhood. A searchlight from a rescue team flashed briefly, cutting through the thick sheet of rain, but there was no sign of the boy. Scott barked sharply, his paws splashing through the growing puddles as he ran back and forth in the street. Sarah barely noticed the dog's urgency as she gripped her soaked coat tighter and turned to the group of neighbors gathered nearby. "He was right here," she shouted, her voice desperate. "He was just playing on the sidewalk." A man from the search team approached her. "We'll find him," he said firmly, though his face betrayed concern. The rain wasn't letting up and the water levels were rising. Every passing minute meant the danger to Pablo grew. Scott barked again, more insistently this time, circling near a storm drain at the end of the block. One of the neighbors, an older man named Frank, noticed and waved toward the dog. "What's gotten into him?" Sarah turned to see Scott pawing at the edge of the drain, his bark sharper, almost frantic now. "Scott, no," she yelled, assuming the dog was panicking like everyone else. But Scott didn't stop. He stood at the drain, his bark growing louder. A flicker of hope crossed Sarah's mind and she rushed toward the dog. "What is it? Is Pablo there?" The rescue worker followed her, aiming his flashlight toward the drain. "Wait," he said, kneeling beside it. "Let's check." Everyone fell silent except for Scott, who continued barking. The light cut into the darkness of the drain, revealing a small figure huddled against the side. Pablo's face was pale, his lips trembling, but his wide eyes looked up at them, alive. "Pablo?" Sarah screamed, dropping to her knees as tears mixed with the rain on her face. "Stay calm," the rescuer shouted, signaling for his team. "We've got him. He's alive." Scott whined softly, pacing anxiously as the rescuers moved into action. Sarah reached out to the dog, her hand trembling. "You found him," she whispered. The neighborhood buzzed with activity as news of Pablo's disappearance spread. Neighbors gathered in small groups, their faces a mixture of worry and exhaustion. The rain hadn't let up, turning the streets into rivers. Flashlights flickered through the heavy downpour as volunteers trudged through the water, calling out Pablo's name. Sarah clung to Scott, who now stayed close to her side, his tail low and ears perked. "He's scared of storms," she muttered to no one in particular, her voice trembling. "He must have been trying to hide from the rain." Frank, the older neighbor who had noticed Scott earlier, stepped forward. "We need more people near the storm drains," he said, his voice firm but kind. "If that's where Scott found him, there could be more to check." A few nodded in agreement, while others whispered concerns about the rising water. The storm drains were filling fast and time was running out. "Over here," shouted a volunteer from the far end of the block. Sarah's heart jumped, but the cry wasn't for Pablo. The group found a child's toy, Pablo's red truck, floating near another drain. Sarah recognized it instantly and grabbed the volunteer's arm. "That's his," she exclaimed, clutching the toy like a lifeline. Scott barked sharply again, pulling against her grasp as if he wanted to run. "Ma'am," one of the rescue workers interrupted, his tone serious. "We'll get to all the drains, but we need to be careful. The currents are dangerous. We can't send anyone into those pipes until we know it's safe." Sarah's grip tightened on the toy, her knuckles white. "But he's out there," she cried, her voice breaking. "And he's alone. We can't just wait." Frank stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Sarah, listen," he said gently. "We'll find him. We all will. But Scott's the only one who seems to know where to go." The group's attention shifted to the dog. Scott stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the nearest drain, ears twitching with the sound of the rushing water. Another bark rang out, this time louder and more urgent. It wasn't just noise, it was a signal. Scott tugged harder on Sarah's soaked sleeve, his barks cutting through the relentless pounding of the rain. His eyes were sharp, focused, almost pleading as he tried to pull her toward the storm drain. Sarah hesitated, torn between trusting the dog's instincts and the growing fear that Pablo might be somewhere else entirely. The lead rescuer stepped closer, his flashlight beam following Scott's pointed gaze. "Dogs don't act like this without a reason," he said, his voice steady despite the tension in the air. "He might know something we don't." Scott barked again, pacing anxiously. Sarah swallowed her doubt, her voice trembling as she called out, "Okay boy, show us." The dog took off immediately, his paws splashing through the ankle-deep water as he ran toward another drain farther down the street. The rescuers and neighbors followed close behind, their flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. The storm was merciless, the wind howling as the rain came down in sheets, but Scott moved with purpose, his body low to the ground, sniffing and stopping briefly before continuing. "Is this it?" Frank asked as they reached the next storm drain. Scott paused, barking furiously, his tail wagging with an urgency that made Sarah's heart race. The rescuer crouched, shining his light into the grate. "Nothing. It's empty," he said, shaking his head. "Let's keep." Before he could finish, Scott sprinted further down the street, toward a larger, older drain partially hidden by overgrown weeds. He stopped abruptly, his barking reaching a frantic pitch. Sarah's breath hitched as she watched the dog claw at the wet ground near the edge of the drain. The rescuer didn't hesitate this time. He dropped to his knees, peering inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Wait," he said, his voice suddenly sharp. "I see something. Movement?" Sarah rushed forward, clutching at the edge of the grate. "Is it him? Is it Pablo?" "Quiet," the rescuer snapped, focusing. A few agonizing seconds passed before he turned to the group, his face pale but determined. "It's him," he confirmed. "He's there." The crowd gasped, relief and fear washing over them simultaneously. Scott stood still, his barking silenced now, as though he knew his job wasn't finished yet. The rescuer's words jolted everyone into action. "He's alive," he repeated, though the tension in his voice was undeniable. "But we have to move fast." Scott whined softly, his body pressed close to the ground as though willing the humans to act faster. Sarah knelt beside the grate, straining to see her son. "Pablo," she called, her voice breaking. "It's Mommy. I'm right here." A faint, trembling voice came back, muffled by the storm and the confines of the drain. "Mom? I'm scared." Tears streamed down Sarah's face, mixing with the rain. "We're coming, sweetheart. Hold on." The rescuer turned to his team. "We need to get this cover off now," he barked. A second rescuer rushed forward with a crowbar, working quickly to pry the rusted metal loose. The grate groaned under the pressure, the sound barely audible over the storm, but it finally gave way with a metallic screech. "Careful," Sarah yelled, clutching Scott's collar to keep him from jumping into the open drain. She peered into the dark, narrow space below as the flashlight beam revealed Pablo's small figure, huddled against the wall of the pipe. His clothes were soaked and his face pale, but his eyes locked onto hers. "I'm scared, Mom," he whispered, tears glistening on his cheeks. Sarah choked back a sob. "You're so brave, baby. Just hold on a little longer." The lead rescuer secured himself with a harness, preparing to descend. "Stay with me, Pablo," he called down. "I'm coming to get you." Scott let out a single bark, his gaze never leaving Pablo. Sarah whispered, "You saved him, Scott. You found my boy." As the rescuer lowered himself into the drain, the crowd fell silent, every breath held. The space was tight, the water rushing and threatening to rise further. Pablo whimpered as the man reached him, his hand extending carefully. "I've got you, kid," he said softly, wrapping an arm around him. "You're safe now." When they emerged moments later, Sarah rushed forward, enveloping Pablo in a trembling embrace. The crowd cheered, a wave of relief spreading through the soaked onlookers. Scott barked once, circling them, his tail wagging furiously. But as Pablo clutched his mother, his small hands gripping his drenched backpack tightly, he whispered something that made Sarah pause. "Mom, don't lose my bag. It's really important." Sarah glanced down at Pablo's soaked backpack, his tiny arms clutching it as though it held his very life. She ran her fingers gently through his wet hair, her voice soft but trembling. "It's okay, sweetie. I've got it. You're safe now." The rescuers helped Sarah and Pablo to a waiting ambulance, the rain still relentless but the sense of urgency shifting. Scott followed closely, his eyes darting between Sarah and the boy. His fur was drenched, but he didn't seem to notice, his every move echoing his protective instincts. Inside the ambulance, Pablo sat on the edge of the stretcher, his small body wrapped in a blanket. He shivered, but his grip on the backpack never loosened. A paramedic checked his vitals, offering a reassuring smile. "He's cold and shaken, but he's going to be fine," she said. Sarah nodded, barely hearing the words. Her eyes were locked on Pablo, her heart still pounding as though she hadn't quite grasped that he was truly safe. "You scared me so much," she whispered, kneeling in front of him. "What were you thinking, running off like that?" Pablo's lip trembled, tears forming in his eyes. I didn't mean to, Mom. I saw Scott barking at something and I thought he needed help." Sarah glanced at the dog, who sat quietly now, his head resting on the edge of the stretcher as if he understood every word. Scott. You were following Scott? Pablo nodded. He was looking at the water and I thought I saw a toy floating by. I didn't want to lose it. But then, his voice faltered and he squeezed the backpack tighter. Then I fell and I got stuck. Tears streamed down Sarah's cheeks as she pulled him into her arms. You don't ever have to risk yourself like that, okay? Nothing is more important than you. Pablo hesitated, then whispered, but this is important, Mom. He held up the backpack, his small fingers trembling. It's not just toys. It's our letters. Sarah frowned, confused. Letters? What letters? The ones I wrote about Scott, Pablo said quietly. I didn't want them to get lost. His voice cracked and he buried his face in her shoulder. He's my best friend, Mom. I had to save them. Sarah's breath caught, and for the first time she saw the backpack not as a simple bag, but as a lifeline to a bond she hadn't fully understood. The ambulance was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine and the rhythmic drip of rain on the roof. Pablo clung to Sarah, his small frame still trembling as exhaustion overtook him. Scott sat patiently at her feet, his eyes never leaving the boy. The backpack sat between them, its contents now carrying a weight far greater than Sarah could have imagined. She hesitated, her hand resting on the zipper. Pablo, she began, her voice gentle but curious, can I see what's inside? Pablo shifted in her lap, his wide eyes meeting hers. They're for Scott, he whispered as if revealing a sacred secret. I wrote them because he makes me feel safe even when I miss Dad and Mom's not home. Her heart ached, guilt creeping into the edges of her mind. She had worked long hours to keep their small household running, often leaving Pablo under the watchful care of Scott. But she hadn't realized the depth of the bond her son had formed with the dog. Slowly, she unzipped the backpack, careful not to disturb its precious contents. Inside, she found a bundle of papers, each one carefully folded and tucked together. The writing was uneven, the scrawl of a child learning his way with words, but each page held a story. Sarah unfolded the top letter, her hands shaking as she read. Dear Scott, thank you for sitting by me when I cried about Dad. You didn't leave even when I told you to. I don't think I'd be brave without you. You're my best friend. Love, Pablo. Her throat tightened and she blinked back tears as she reached for another. Each letter painted a picture of quiet companionship. Scott lying beside Pablo during storms, nudging him gently when he felt sad, or simply wagging his tail as if to say, I'm here. The paramedic, sitting across from them, spoke softly. That dog's not just loyal, she said. He's a guardian. Sarah nodded, her voice catching in her throat. He's more than that. He's family. Pablo looked up at her, his voice small but firm. That's why I had to save them, Mom. Scott saved me so many times and I wanted to remember it. Forever. Sarah hugged him tightly, the letters pressed between them, a testament to the unspoken bond between a boy and his dog. By the time the rain began to ease, the ambulance had parked at the edge of the neighborhood where a small crowd of neighbors waited anxiously. Word of Pablo's rescue and Scott's role in it had already spread, drawing people together despite the storm's lingering aftermath. As Sarah stepped out, carrying Pablo in her arms, a ripple of applause broke through the quiet. Scott followed close behind, his wet coat glistening in the faint glow of the streetlights. Pablo rested his head on his mother's shoulder, his grip still firm on the backpack that carried his precious letters. Frank, the older neighbor who had first noticed Scott's unusual behavior, stepped forward, his voice warm. That's one brave boy you've got there and one incredible dog. Sarah managed a smile, though her face still showed the strain of the night. I don't know what we would have done without Scott, she said, her voice faltering. He didn't just find Pablo, he saved him. The rescuers nodded in agreement, and one of them knelt down to pet Scott. I've seen search dogs in action, he said, but this one, he knew exactly what to do. He wouldn't give up. Pablo stirred, lifting his head to look at the gathering. Scott's not just a dog, he said softly, his voice carrying a childlike certainty. He's my hero. The crowd fell silent for a moment, the weight of Pablo's words settling over them. Then, as if on cue, someone started clapping. It spread quickly, the sound swelling with gratitude and admiration. Scott wagged his tail, his eyes bright but calm, as if he understood the recognition wasn't just for him, it was for the bond he shared with Pablo. Sarah lowered Pablo to the ground, and he stood on shaky legs, holding his backpack close. I want to show them, he said, looking up at her. Show them what? She asked gently. The letters, he replied. I want them to know how special Scott is. Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. She opened the backpack and handed him the bundle of papers. Pablo held them up, his small voice steady. These are about Scott. He's been my best friend since everything changed. And tonight he saved me. He's always been there for me. The neighbors listened intently, their eyes on the boy and his dog. What began as a story of survival became something deeper, a testament to the quiet, unwavering loyalty that only a dog like Scott could provide. For the first time, the storm's destruction felt distant, overshadowed by the warmth of a community united in hope and gratitude. As the applause faded, Pablo sat on a dry patch of ground surrounded by the neighbors, clutching his letters. Scott lay beside him, his head resting on Pablo's lap, his brown eyes filled with calm loyalty. Sarah stood close, her hand lightly resting on Pablo's shoulder. The night had shifted from chaos to something far more profound, a moment of unity centered on a boy, his dog, and a series of letters that carried the weight of a child's heart. One by one, Pablo unfolded the pages and read aloud. His small voice carried through the damp air, recounting stories of quiet evenings where Scott lay by his side after hard days, or mornings when the dog's cheerful bark was the only thing that made him smile. Each letter revealed pieces of Pablo's pain, the loss of his father, Sarah's long hours away, and how Scott's quiet presence had filled the spaces they couldn't. Dear Scott, Pablo read, his voice faltering but steady, you make me feel safe when I miss Dad. I think you know how I feel because you stay close even when I don't talk. You're my best friend and I hope you never leave me. Frank cleared his throat, his weathered hand wiping at the corner of his eye. Other neighbors stood quietly, some nodding, others holding back tears. Sarah's chest tightened as she watched her son pour his heart out, realizing how deeply the boy had depended on Scott during the moments she hadn't been able to be there. After the last letter, the crowd broke into soft murmurs of admiration. One woman, kneeling beside Pablo, spoke up. You're lucky to have Scott, but I think he's lucky too. You love him in a way not everyone does. Pablo smiled shyly, his fingers brushing the dog's ears. I just know he understands me. The lead rescuer, who had stayed nearby to monitor the boy's condition, crouched to Scott's level, scratching under his chin. Not all heroes wear capes, he said. Some just bark until we listen. The crowd chuckled lightly, but the sentiment was clear. Scott wasn't just a dog. He was a lifeline, a bridge between a boy and a world that sometimes felt too big. His legacy wasn't just in saving Pablo that night, it was in the countless quiet acts of love that had kept the boy afloat in his hardest moments. Pablo hugged Scott tightly, burying his face in the dog's fur. You're my hero, he whispered again. And Scott, as always, stayed right by his side. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the streets muddy and the air filled with the crisp scent of rain-soaked earth. Neighbors worked to clean up debris, but the previous night's events lingered in their minds and conversations. Scott and Pablo had become the quiet heroes of the community, their story a reminder of resilience and loyalty. Sarah stood in their small backyard watching as Pablo played with Scott. Despite his exhaustion, the boy had insisted on going outside as soon as the sun broke through the clouds. Scott trotted beside him, his tail wagging as they chased a ball through the soft, damp grass. You're not letting him out of your sight, huh? Frank's voice came from over the fence as he leaned on the railing. His smile was warm and Sarah could see the gratitude in his eyes, a reflection of the entire neighborhood's feelings. Sarah nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I don't think I ever really understood how much Scott meant to Pablo until last night, she admitted. He's not just a dog to us. He's family. Frank chuckled. I'd say he's earned that title. Pablo ran up to them then, clutching Scott's collar with one hand and holding the now dried letters in the other. Mom, he said breathlessly, can we make something for Scott? Like a special collar or a medal? Sarah knelt to his level, her hand brushing his cheek. I think Scott already has something more important than a medal, she said softly. He has you. Pablo grinned, looking down at the dog. Yeah, but he deserves something extra. He's my hero. Frank leaned closer. Why don't we do something as a community? A little celebration for Scott, and for you too, Pablo. You're as brave as they come. Pablo's face lit up, and Sarah felt a swell of pride as she hugged him close. Scott barked once as if approving of the idea, and wagged his tail so hard that it thumped against Sarah's leg. Over the next few weeks, the neighborhood organized a small gathering. Kids played in the yard, families shared food, and Scott was the center of attention, wearing a handmade medal Pablo had crafted with glitter and cardboard. The letters were framed and displayed on a table, serving as a reminder of the quiet, powerful connection between a boy and his dog. As the evening settled in, Sarah watched Pablo and Scott sitting together on the porch steps. The boy rested his head against the dog's shoulder, their bond unspoken but unbreakable. The laughter of neighbors filled the air, but for Sarah, the moment belonged to them, her son and the dog who had saved not just his life but his spirit. It was a new beginning for all of them. The storm had tested their strength, but in its aftermath, it left something beautiful: a community united, a boy healed, and a dog forever cherished. As the sun set on Pablo and Scott's story, we are reminded of the quiet heroes in our lives, the ones who stay by our side through every storm, who offer unconditional love, and who ask for nothing in return. Scott wasn't just a dog, he was a lifeline, a symbol of loyalty and courage that changed not only Pablo's life but also the hearts of an entire community. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the bonds that shape us and the love that saves us, don't keep it to yourself. Hit the like button, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the power of friendship, and leave a comment about the heroes in your life. And if you want more stories like this, stories that inspire, uplift, and remind us of what truly matters, subscribe to our channel. Join our community, and together, let's keep spreading the light, one story at a time.